This week, Nickolas Means from SIM is with us to discuss building amazing distributed teams. Then Josh Corman from Clarity joins us to talk about the national cybersecurity strategy. Finally, in the enterprise security news, a raft of solid seed and Series A fundings. Cisco acquires Lightspin. XM Cyber acquires Confluera. MasterCard acquires Baffin Bay Networks. YouTube channels keep getting hacked. Bing Bang, more problems for Microsoft. Pausing AI experiments. AI prompt injection. Zero trust challenges persist. Public companies aren't adding security experts to their boards. All that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly and happy World Backup Day, which is actually tomorrow, but we're streaming today, not tomorrow. So this is episode 311, recorded on Thursday, March 30th, 2023. I'm your host, Adrian Sanabria, and joining me is, brace yourself for stereotypes, the acolyte of Apple, the prince of poutine, Guillaume Ross. How are you, Guillaume?
Thank you. I'm doing great. I think the official title is Poutine Sommelier.
Poutine Sommelier.
Thanks for reminding me that it's World Backup Day. I do have one of my 62 domains I don't use called isnotabackup.info, where I used to list a bunch of things that are not backups. So I think I need to bring that back up for the public good.
Bring it back up?
He got what I was doing there.
Yeah, I'm. This is one of those few. I mean, usually it's something silly that we bring up, but World Backup Day is it's important to draw attention to backups, especially for consumers, for folks who don't necessarily back things up. I've seen so many cases where people were not syncing their photos with the cloud and they lose the phone. Can't get into the phone, or something happens to a family member and all their data is locked up and safely encrypted and nobody can get to it. Nobody can pay the bills. So I guess more than just backups, like I tell people you need to think about sharing account, like critical account access and stuff like that.
Personal disaster recovery is what I call it, right?
Disaster.
And I think as security people, we might be like even more at risk than a lot, because like your laptop is backed up, encrypted on a NAS that's encrypted, that's in the cloud with client-side encryption, and in the end, is anyone ever going to be able to restore? So I think we need a World Test Your Restore Day more than a World Backup Day.
So World Backup Day is tomorrow. So maybe World Restore Day is April 1st. I didn't realize we're so close to April 1st. Yeah, so.
Yep. Be careful with the news.
Yep, absolutely. All right, quick announcement here. Security Weekly listeners, Identiverse 2023 is heading to Vegas. Join the digital identity community at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, May 30th to June 2nd. Identiverse is a must-attend annual event that brings together over 2,500 security professionals for 4 days of world-class learning, engagement, and entertainment. As a community member, you're able to receive 20% off your Identiverse 2023 tickets using code IDV23-SW20. Register today at securityweekly.com/Identiverse 2023. All right, and today we're talking about trust, autonomy, and building amazing distributed teams. We've got Nickolas Means with us today. He's the VP of Engineering at SIM. He's been building software engineering teams for over a decade. He's an international keynote speaker and enjoys reading about engineering and aviation incidents while drinking excellent coffee. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's this is something that has impacted me personally and probably Guillaume personally, but building engineering teams, I've got direct appreciation for how difficult that can be. And maybe to start out, let's chat a bit about your work background and how you came to to be building your own engineering teams? Do you have a dev background? Do you have an IT background? How did you come into this?
I do have a dev background. I spent about a decade as a software engineer before I shifted onto the other side of the software engineering universe and started leading teams. I like to joke that I'm maybe the only person that decided to do that on purpose. Decided to shift from technology to leadership. Tried it as a team lead and quickly found that I was way more fascinated by the human problems than I was by the technical problems I had been solving. And so kind of stuck with me from there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely interesting. And there's so many different styles and approaches. Like one of the things that's really bugged me over the years is I feel like a lot of organizations don't have a good sense of how to track productivity. You know, with everybody moving to work from home, the pandemic, I feel like that got ratcheted up even more. How do I know if work's getting done if I don't see butts in seats? Kind of really uncovered the lack of ability to see productivity. And maybe it's easier with software engineers than anyone else because a lot of that work does end up being visual, right? If you're checking code into repositories and things like that. Or am I wrong? Am I off?
No, I think you're spot on. I think that's actually a problem that a lot of leaders that are used to leading in an office environment ran into when everybody suddenly went remote at the beginning of the pandemic. It is pretty easy when you're in an office environment to kind of use the looking around the office, seeing who's there early, who looks like they're busy, who's surfing Reddit or whatever, and make your decision on who's being productive, who's getting good work done based on that. That, like you said, the button seat style of management. You take that away, and all of a sudden, you have to understand people's productivity in a very different way. You have to understand what they're producing. You have to look at, in some cases, systemic production versus individual production to figure out if people are actually doing their jobs, if things are getting done. And to your point, I think that's especially true for teams that aren't producing code, that are doing other things in an organization.
Yeah. One of the other things I learned is software engineers are probably, and this might just be my anecdotal experience, but it seems like they're more likely to have side hustles and distractions than other technology workers, maybe. Have you found that to be true at all?
I think it's definitely true. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing because there's a lot of learning that happens in those side hustles, and people bring that learning back to the place that they work. But it kind of gets into the theme of what we wanted to talk about in this segment, and that's the trust and autonomy piece. You can balance those two things. You can balance the side hustle with the main job as long as you're really tuned in and motivated and feel connected to the day job. Feel motivated to do that work.
Right.
When that connection starts to fizzle out, when it starts to get a little bit sloppy, then it is tempting to be a little bit more distracted there. It is a little bit more, it'll intrude a little bit more. And that's a thing that leaders have to keep in mind as they lead teams, that their job is to set that context and to motivate.
So is the book and also the concept extreme ownership like really popular with engineering management as it is, I've seen in security circles as well, but that sense of I guess giving a crap about what you're throwing over the wall when you're putting something together, you're doing pull requests, checking stuff in. Is that? Can you put metrics around that? How do you handle that as a leader?
I haven't seen Jocko's stuff referenced as much on the engineering side of the house as on the ops side of the house. I know I've heard about it from all of my ops friends and all of my SRE friends. Not as much from engineering friends. But the question of how do you measure that is a really interesting one. How do you measure ownership? How do you measure how bought in people actually are? And I think one of the challenges there is you actually have to give people room for that to happen. There's sort of this default mode of management that happens, especially in the shift to distributed work in the wake of the pandemic, when you had those managers that were used to managing in an office and felt like they almost had to micromanage in a distributed environment to make sure that everybody knew what they were supposed to be working on, make sure everybody was doing their jobs. And that the the micromanagery approach to leading a team is one thing that will almost entirely deprive you of getting to see people take ownership of things that need to get done.
Right. And it's, I remember reading a paper a while back called Better Testing, Worse Quality from, I think her name was Elizabeth Hendrickson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but she's in the QA world. And the idea was that when she was noticing when they put QA folks in place, the developers worried less about quality because there was now somebody who had quality in their title. So they felt a responsibility shift for that and ended up doing, poorer quality work. And to fix that, she determined that responsibility needed to be vocally shifted back to the software engineer, and then they had to constrain the QA resource. So then, and to what you say, she notes you can't do that without giving them the extra time that they're going to need to turn out higher quality stuff, with similar deadlines, or deadlines are just going to have to shift to accommodate that. But, I took that and, I wondered if that didn't also apply to security, because in a lot of cases I've seen security, the presence of a security department kind of seen as a shift of responsibility. Like security is not something, even beyond, just a kind of passive thought that somebody else is worrying about security, so I don't need to, but almost more active, where I've seen some security teams say, you can't do this. Only we can do the job of security, right? So they, they actively pull away responsibility for that. And I wonder if that's, if that's something that we have to manage as well.
It's interesting, as you were talking about Elizabeth's paper, that was the first thing that jumped to mind, is sort of that relationship between engineering and security. The best security teams I've ever seen are the ones that take a more consultative approach. They show up, they help you threat model the feature that you're going to build. They help you figure out which things to pay attention to, which things are safe to not spend as much time on, and build out that plan as you're building a feature. That was certainly the case with the security team at GitHub. Anytime we would kick off a large new project, yes, it was a checklist on a check on a checklist of things you needed to do to kick off a project, but it was a thing that people actually welcomed at the start of a project. Was, let's get security in here to look at this feature, to talk about what we're building and figure out how we build it in a safe way. Whereas on the other hand, when what you're talking about kind of happens, when you have a security department that takes on all of that responsibility, that is vocally in charge and owns security for the organization, engineers spend less time thinking about it.
Right. Well, that's for sure, and I agree with you that the teams that I've seen are more consultative, have better success. And I always keep that in mind when I see these stats saying, "Oh, we need 1 million more cybersecurity experts in the U.S. by 2023," or blah blah blah. And to me, it feels like that just doesn't scale, right? Like that million new people, are they just like all finding issues and not addressing them, or what are they supposed to do? Whereas I think if we collaborate, then you can scale much more, right? And that's why I think when I was doing consulting, for example, I think I saw a lot of companies that had really good security with pretty small security teams, and I also saw some that had bad security with huge teams that just found a lot of issues, but just didn't get much done, right? So is that what you're observing as well, that with a smaller team, if you collaborate properly, you might be able to get much more done than with a much bigger security team?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it goes back to that concept of ownership. Who owns security in the organization? If the people that are writing the code don't ultimately own it, same with quality. If people that are writing the code don't ultimately own the quality of the product, then they're not going to pay as much attention to as they need to. And to your point, Guillaume, you have to scale out a huge army of security professionals or QA professionals to try to make up for that gap. Whereas if you can build that ownership of security, of QA, of product thinking, of building for the customer, if you can build that into your engineering process and teach your engineers that stuff is important every time you build anything, then you can get much better results without having to spend as much money on outside personnel. Now, that's not to say they're not important. It's not to say that QA professionals, security professionals, product managers don't have a role. They absolutely do. I just think that the right way for that to happen is for it to be a more consultative, educational approach, where you build that ownership into the engineering process versus outsource it from the engineering process.
Well, and that's the trust bit, right? Like trusting that you've hired a professional, they can do their job, like you need to enable them to do that and somewhat get out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. When I first shifted into management, this was a thing that I struggled with. I felt like I needed to look busy in order to be perceived as doing my job. And it took me a number of years of being in that manager seat to realize that that's not what it's about. And I needed to be looking for leadership to work under that could look at the results of what my team was producing to judge my work, to judge my approach as a manager, versus looking at me and going, oh, is he busy? Is he producing direct output? Is he writing documents? That sort of thing. And I think this is it's a trap that a lot of new managers fall into, where they shift out of an IC role where they're used to that fast feedback loop of writing code, seeing what happens, writing code, seeing what happens. And they shift into a role that has a much longer feedback loop. And instead of leaning into that trusting their team to do good work, trusting their manager to see their good work without a ton of direct individual contributor style output, they just get busy to try to prove they're doing something. And they end up overmanaging, micromanaging, kind of making a mess of the situation because that trust piece is missing.
Yeah, and I worry that in some organizations you might have to do that. Like you might have to do the wrong things, to keep your job, to make some of the management happy. So that's kind of where I want to go next. Is if you're brought into an organization that kind of has the wrong approach to things. The approaches that don't work, but they don't really know how to do it any better. So they keep just pushing harder in the wrong direction. Where do you start? You come into an organization, say as a engineering lead, and I think a lot of this applies to, most of what we're talking about doesn't just apply to software engineers, but to tech teams in general. And goals are being missed, deadlines are being missed. Management isn't happy with the employees aren't happy with management. Where do you start?
That's a great question. And it's hard to answer because it's always so situational.
Right.
For me in that situation, it's always, okay, deadlines are being missed, goals are being missed. The engineering organization is not doing the job that the rest of the organization expects it to do. Is it a productivity gap? Is it a communication gap? Do we not understand how hard our system is to work on? And so it takes us longer than we think it will to build anything because we've got a lot of technical debt that's weighing us down. So that's kind of step one is figuring out where the gap actually is, where the two sides are not meeting up. And then from there, figuring out how to go about addressing it. One of the common pitfalls that I've seen when I've joined a new organization is trying to do too much at the same time. WIP limits are a thing that I reach for almost every time, because if an engineering team is going slower and not producing as much work as you expect them to, counterintuitively, 9 times out of 10, it's because they're trying to do too many things at the same time. And they're spending so much time context switching that they can't actually do work. When it's not that, it's a mismatch in expectations. They're not understanding what the organization needs from them because the organization has not been clear about what the actual priority is and what things they can compromise on in order to get that priority across the line. So it's almost always just missing context on one side or the other.
Yeah, so there's 2 things I want to kind of dive into there that you mentioned. One is setting expectations. I think you mentioned an expectations gap, and that's a tough one, right? Like somebody's going to ask you, how long is this going to take you to do like this particular PR, this particular feature, something like that. And the engineer gives an estimate, not knowing, how many rabbit holes they're going to end up going down, or, what kind of crazy duct tape code they're going to have to rewrite, refactor, when they turn over different stones and stuff like that. Like, how do you handle that? Because in my experience, almost always the initial expectation of the engineer is way too, ends up being way too short, ends up being way too hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. It's humans in general have this tendency to think that they can get something done in a lot less time than it's actually going to take them to get it done. And it's not just software engineering. I mean, I think when I go and clean my house, it's going to take me less time and it ends up taking me a whole day. And then I'm frustrated that I've spent my whole day doing it.
Right,
so
your to-do list had 40 other things on it, right?
Yep.
Right, but I think the main difference there is if you clean your house, you could get better at estimating how long that takes because it'll be relatively similar from time to time. Whereas when we're working on software, we're pretty often doing something that, sometimes you'll re-implement something that's the same thing you've done before, but slightly different. But in many cases, you're doing something brand new. It's just so much harder to evaluate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a bit of a contrarian on this point in that I'm not a big believer in estimates. I think by and large, they're just noise. Unless you've spent a ton of time really dialing them in, understanding how long it takes you to build things. You've got, if you're using a Fibonacci sequence to estimate, you've got great example tasks for every number on the Fibonacci sequence. Team's been working together for a long time and has built a lot of context around those numbers. Then you can kind of start getting close to estimates and getting estimates right and being able to extract kind of reverse engineered time values out of that. But how much time do you spend to get there? And are accurate estimates really worth it? Is it really worth spending that much time to make them accurate? Versus kind of the approach that I prefer is if it's a thing that has a real date that we need to have it done by a certain date, great. Let's work to that date. Let's figure out what the scope and quality levers need to look like in order for us to hit that date. And if we get close and we're not hitting it, okay, what can we pull back on? What can we compromise on so that we make sure that we are delivering something that does the job that the organization needs it to do by that date? If there's not a date, okay, great. Then let's look at our priorities. Let's figure out what the most important things are that we need to get done and kind of how many of them we think we need to get done this quarter and work to that. I would much prefer to calibrate an engineering team towards the organization's expectation of how much they need to get them done, obviously managing that and pushing back when it's unrealistic, than to spend a ton of time giving estimates and then missing them, and then giving estimates and then missing them.
So it sounds like you're talking about replacing, like putting a lot of effort into an accurate estimation with more frequent check-ins, and so you can make adjustments more often as needed to hit that date. Is that a good summary?
Yep, that's a great summary. And then, I mean, the thing you lose there, and the thing that I think most organizations actually want out of, at least most engineering leaders want out of their estimation processes, is talking about features before you build them, actually unpacking them, trying to figure out as best you can what's in them. And there's other ways of accomplishing that. You don't necessarily have to put a number on it to have that level of depth in your discussion about a potential feature you're thinking about building. At SEM, one of the things that we do is we write a feature brief for everything that we're going to build. My product partner fills out like the change log entry that we want to be able to publish at the end of that feature effort and writes a little bit of context around the customer problem. Then we hand that brief off to an engineer, and they spend the time digging into the customer context, figuring out the right way to actually solve that problem versus having a feature prescribed to them to go out and build.
So they're enabled to perform some of what some people would think of as the product work on their own, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I don't know. I always like to say that product's job is really to bring customer context into the conversation. What is the customer struggling with? What does the customer need us to solve for them? What does the customer need us to build for them? Okay, now bring those things as inputs to the engineering process and let the engineers do the thing that engineers do and find, frankly, the laziest way to solve it. Because everybody that got into engineering tends to get into it because they like using code as a way to get leverage on a problem. And that means they're very efficient problem solvers.
More efficient,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a term meant to get your attention, but yeah, that's essentially what it means is more efficient, finding a way to solve a problem more simply through the use of code. And it's something that if you give an engineering team a backlog of well-defined work that tells them exactly what to build, that part of their brain often just doesn't even get engaged. Whereas if you give them a backlog full of problems to solve, and you give them the time to actually solve those problems and to be collaborative in coming up with the solutions, you get much better solutions, and generally you get them faster.
So what you're talking about, is this similar to the Amazon 6-pager? Is this like a form of a PRD? Are these all different things or similar?
They're similar concepts. We don't spend as much time on them, putting them together as like an Amazon 6-pager, for example, just because we don't want to spend a ton of time on that artifact. We want it to be essentially only what we need to have an effective discussion around what we're going to build and how we're going to build it. And it usually ends up being, if you printed one out, it might be 2 pages on the long side, but we tend to work in pretty small units as well. So, what part of this problem can we solve over the next 2 weeks? Can we actually deploy that? Okay, it's going to be a longer running effort. What check-in do we want to get to by the end of 2 weeks to know if we're kind of on track on this project for where we want to be? We're making the kind of progress and haven't hit a bunch of unanticipated problems as we've been building it.
And then perhaps somewhat related, I've heard people throw around the idea of a pre-mortem. Have you heard of those before?
I've heard the term, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so as I understand it, it's kind of the idea of like spending more time, not just unpacking what it's going to be like to build the feature, but also unpacking all the myriad ways that it could fail, like it could break or that kind of
sounds
key
similar
things.
to threat modeling, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I wouldn't have called it that term, but that is a section that we have in the brief document that we do every time we do a feature. It's sort of open questions and unknowns, and it's okay. Here are the holes that we might fall into. And as we're discussing the project before we kick it off, sometimes we'll choose to do a spike in one of those directions just to kind of prove that out, get a little bit more solid ground before we commit to building the feature the way that we think we're going to build it.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to jump into is you're talking about doing too many things. How do you know if you're doing too many things? And you mentioned context switching, which as somebody with ADHD who already struggles with focus issues, I'm always educating people on context switching and the cost of that, especially when I find in a lot of cases like management folks maybe don't have a good understanding of what it takes to do creative work, like how long it takes to get into that state of focus and to maintain that state of focus, and the impact of adding yet another meeting in the middle of that free time, the impact that has on productivity. So maybe unpack that a little bit, what it means, how you can recognize when you're doing too many things and people are struggling to be productive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I would pull out of the question you just asked is the idea that software engineering is creative work, because it absolutely is, and I think that's a thing that's probably underappreciated in the industry at large is just how much it has in common with other creative pursuits versus some other forms of more hard physical engineering where there's steel is steel is steel. It's going to behave like steel. That's not necessarily true of a complex software system. And so there is a huge element of creative problem solving that goes into building anything in the software world. And so that's kind of the baseline that we have to operate from. I like the idea. Paul Graham had introduced the idea, I don't know, in a blog post probably 15 years ago of manager time versus maker time. Yeah. And that's a pretty important concept to me. I try to put one-on-ones on my team's calendar in places where it's not going to disrupt their most productive time of day, where I'm not going to pull them out of flow in order to have a 30-minute conversation with them. Doesn't always work, but I never want to interrupt their flow with a meeting if I can help it. One of the interesting experiments that we tried at SIM that's worked surprisingly well for us, it's an idea that came from Ben Darfler at Honeycomb. He wrote a blog post, has kind of a clickbaity title. I think it's something like the daily stand-up is dead for remote teams. Here's what to do instead. But the crux of the idea is to have a 1-hour daily team sync, just a 1-hour standing meeting on the calendar every day, which sounds terrifying to me and to any software engineer that you try to introduce this idea to. But the theory behind it is that it defragments your calendar. So if you kind of spend this hour together talking through the issues, talking through what you're building, then you don't have to have sort of a shotgun of, let's take this offline 30-minute meetings throughout the rest of the day to pull you out of flow. You get that 1-hour meeting out of the way, and then you kind of have the rest of your day to yourself to work if you're an engineer. My calendar as a manager is obviously less forgiving than that. I've got a lot more meetings than that, but it frees my team up to focus in a way that all of those meetings that used to spring out of our 15-minute stand-up were just interruptive.
Right. So you're creating this expectation of this section of time is always going to be a meeting time taken up. But whatever we need to talk about, you better squeeze it into that time because the rest of the time is off limits, right? Mm-hmm. You're protecting the rest of that time.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, we keep a running agenda. If we don't get to all of it, there are days when there are things that are important that we let the meeting run a little bit long for. But most of the time, anything we don't get to, we can just kick to tomorrow.
So do those take the place of your 14 weekly one-on-ones with your direct reports, or do you still have to do those?
I still have to do those. I'm pretty convicted that that's the most important thing that a manager can do is one-on-ones. Mm-hmm. It's so important from a coaching perspective. It's so important from a career development perspective. It's so important from a gathering context perspective. Just understanding how the team is working together to build software, understanding what problems they're running into. Those things will come up in a one-on-one where they might not come up in a group setting.
And how do you pull out the important things in those meetings? Like I've been in a lot of those, like you're talking about the stand-up meetings, but also the one-on-one meetings where kind of the default, like everybody, how's everything going? Anybody have any concerns or issues they need to talk about? And, everybody's goal on that call is to get off that call. So nobody brings anything up. Everybody, oh yeah, it's fine. And, in truth, you look at everything's on fire. There's a bunch of problems that could probably be eased by bringing it out and talking about it, maybe getting two people teamed up together to tackle something. But how do you surface that in those calls? Because I feel like either it just doesn't occur to you when you're asked at that time. Like should people be compiling this information somewhere, preparing for these calls in some way, or is there a different way to lead these calls that kind of pulls the issues that need to be discussed to the surface?
It's interesting. I think one of the most important things to do in a one-on-one is to talk about not work things, just to build that relationship. Okay. Because the thing that often gets missed is building that foundation of relationship, that foundation of psychological safety that lets somebody say something to you that's a little uncomfortable to hear in the first place. Because they have to, in order to bring up something that they're worried about or they're concerned about or they're mad about, the first thing they're going to think about is, okay, how is this going to make me look if I raise this issue to my manager? Right. And so if you as the manager haven't done the work to make it safe to raise that issue, you're never going to hear about it. And then the other thing that I tend to run a pretty open one-on-one. Sometimes some of the folks that I lead like keeping one-on-one agendas. Most of them don't. And we just kind of wander around to the things that are important to them to talk about after we kind of catch up on how life is and what's going on. But we also have a retro every 2 weeks, and it has an anonymous section in it, which it's interesting the arc of that anonymous section of the retro over time. Like when I first introduced it, a whole lot of stuff got shared in that section. That was probably the busiest section.
Like what do you mean when you say retro? Like unpack that a little bit first.
Yeah, great question. So every couple of weeks, we have a 1 hour conversation on the calendar at the end of one of our 2 week cycles to just talk about what went well, what didn't go so well, what we're concerned about, what we want to change in our software engineering process or in our product or really anything. And it's an open discussion, so folks on the team can raise things that they think went well, things that didn't go well. But then we have an anonymous section, and it's titled Feelings. And it's we do it in Google Docs, so everybody opens it in anonymous mode and just types in the things that they want to type into that section of the document. And it does a couple of jobs. First of all, calling it Feelings makes it okay to bring feelings to work, because I think so often we try to turn that part of ourselves off at work, and it's uncomfortable not to, but it's important not to, because it's what makes us human. And by pretending we don't have those feelings, it's actually much harder for us to work together. Whereas if we can talk about them a little bit more openly, we can work through whatever's causing them. So that's one of the things I like about that section. But the other is it makes it safe to raise slightly controversial things that you might feel like are a little bit scary to raise, a little bit scary to talk about. And then my job as the person who's introduced this retro format is to make those things safe. to talk about them in a way that whoever put it on that document knows that is a safe thing for us to talk about, that we can discuss things that are hard and a little bit scary and make progress on them. And the thing that kind of happens over time is there's less and less in that anonymous section, and more of it just gets talked about in open forum because people feel comfortable and safe bringing that stuff up.
One big advantage of anonymous feedback like that I've seen in different companies, so either in retrospectives or, for example, one of the things that we do here at Jupiter One is we really encourage people to submit things to the security team that they think could be improved, right? Like, oh, I don't think this process could be better or whatever. And by being anonymous, you eliminate the risk of being voluntold to fix it, right? Like, oh, you saw the issue, you fix it. And sometimes people will identify issues that, for whatever reason, maybe it's not their direct responsibility. Maybe they actually don't want to be involved in fixing it, or maybe they don't really know how to fix it, but they know it's a problem. And by being anonymous, then they just don't feel like they're at risk of being told to go and fix the problem. And that's always a good way of making sure that people do discuss these things that might be very important, but that they might just be afraid of discussing otherwise, right? So sometimes it's not because it's controversial, it's just because, if I'm the one that mentions this, then I'm going to be told I now own this and I have to fix it, and it's not really my thing, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if we're told anonymously, then we can just find the best person to go and fix it, which sometimes might end up being the same person, but not always.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of goes hand in hand with like the idea that you shouldn't bring a problem to your manager without bringing a solution as well. And there's some validity to spending time thinking about how you could solve a potential problem that you're raising to your manager and seeing if you can potentially address it yourself before you raise it. But what do you do if the answer is no, and there's an expectation that you're supposed to bring a solution? What if you don't have any idea how to solve that problem? Having an anonymous section of a retro or another anonymous feedback mechanism makes it where you can safely raise that problem without necessarily having to be the one that solves it. And then over time, doing it in retro, the thing I love about it is it brings it into the context of collaborative problem solving, where whoever raised it doesn't feel the onus on themselves to be the one that has to solve it.
Yeah, and one of the other things there, I'm always worried that I'm the squeaky wheel, that I bring up too many problems. And, sometimes like when it's not anonymous, I'm like, I already brought up 3 problems this week. I've hit my limit. I'm not going to bring anything else up.
Yep, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, I love that idea. I was just chatting on our Discord saying I'm going to have to go back and rewatch this and take notes because there's a lot of good advice here. Let's shift over to talking about distributed teams and some of the challenges there. In a lot of jobs that I've worked, there's so many challenges. Like one of them is just time zones. For a year and a half, I was the only U.S. employee of an entirely South African company.
Oh my goodness.
And they're 7 hours ahead, 7 or 8 hours, depending on where our stupid daylight savings time was at the time. And so I'm not even sure where to begin there. Do you have a good starting point on distributed teams, like how you manage the culture, how you get people to work together, when maybe they speak different languages, they're sitting in different countries. I'm not sure how distributed your teams are, what kind of issues that you've had to deal with.
So my team right now is only in US time zones, but I have worked with folks in CET before, and I've had sort of that long spread where I had maybe an hour or two overlap with a few of the folks that I managed. It's interesting. I think my best tip for building a productive distributed team that's different from what you would do in an office environment is to allow margin around meetings. In an office environment, you show up to the conference room, everybody should be on time. You kind of shut the chatter down early and get to work on the bulk of whatever it is you're there to talk about. In a remote environment, you sort of have to allow some margin around meetings for folks to have those connections that are not work related, for them to build connections that are human from outside of their work life. I talked about the 1 hour sync that we do. The other piece of that I think is really critical is we intentionally waste, quote unquote, the first 10 minutes of it. We don't get into the meat of the sync until we've just kind of sat there and shot the breeze for 10 minutes.
Nobody has to feel guilty about that because you've given them permission.
Exactly. And it fills the role that like gathering around the coffee maker or the water cooler or going to lunch together or going to happy hour together would fill in an in-office environment, at least part of the way. Right. I think you still have to get together face to face every now and again, because there's some level of human connection that you really can't build any other way than just sitting down to a meal together and having a good time together, eating and drinking and talking. But if you've got that foundation periodically, then having 10 or 15 minutes to waste just talking to each other on a daily or every other day basis can go a long way to making those connections last longer before you have to get people together in person again and kind of re-up them.
And before we have to wrap this conversation, I just want to touch a bit on your research into because this is something I've done as well, and I find this fascinating. Kind of looking to successes and failures in other places, like outside your own vertical, outside your own outside software engineering, basically. So aviation, engineering, things like that. What are some of the interesting things that you've learned reading about aviation accidents or engineering successes or failures and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first conference presentation I did on this was about United Flight 232. And I'll spare the gory details, but sort of the conclusion from that incident was it was the first aviation accident where the idea of crew resource management got the crew to a better outcome than they would have gotten to otherwise. And crew resource management is the idea that during an emergency situation, everybody's voice in the cockpit matters. Everybody has a role in solving that situation. Kind of the paradigm before that was that the captain's word went, and whatever the captain said was what they would do. There's a famous incident where a plane flew around the airport in Portland because it had a landing gear light on that showed that the landing gear wasn't extended. And despite the navigator saying over and over again, we're about out of fuel, they never made the approach to the airport and landed. They actually crashed about a mile or two out of the field because nobody wanted to challenge the captain on the fact that they were out of fuel. And so, applying that to a software engineering team, it's pretty easy to make a case that you need to make a psychologically safe environment so that everybody can have input into the problem that you're trying to solve. And then you can go and read Google's Project Aristotle document and some other things around the effects of psychological safety on software engineering teams and see that carry into the software engineering world. I've done a talk on 3 Mile Island as well, and there's so much good learning there from the idea of second stories and blameless postmortems. Because on a first pass, some of the things the operators did look pretty counterintuitive and like they might have made the accident worse. But then you get into actually the why they did what they did, and it makes perfect sense. It was an educational gap, and they were actually doing the best that they possibly could have given the training that they'd received and the understanding they had of the reactor that they were operating.
I feel like that's one of the reasons I enjoyed Chernobyl so much, even though it's such a dark series, the HBO Chernobyl series. But I feel like they did a good job in that. In like, I mean, there's an entire episode that's nothing but a postmortem, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. The book Midnight at Chernobyl is really good as well, along those same lines. Kind of gets into more detail about the sequence that happened there.
And before we let you go, I think you have a few more good resources to recommend. You mentioned a few. I can remind you if you don't remember what you mentioned in the prep call.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's been so long since we had that prep call.
Skunkworks was one.
Yeah, I did a talk on Skunkworks, and that really has informed a lot of the ownership approach that I take in leading software engineering teams, because that was a big part of what Kelly Johnson did at Skunkworks. The amazing planes that they built there, like the SR-71, the F-117, the U-2, they were all built with surprisingly small staffs. And the way that they were able to be successful was that he gave them all tremendous ownership in the project, and he trusted them to either get it done or raise their hand early and ask for help if they needed help, if they couldn't solve the problem that they had set out to solve. Some very clear parallels in that. And there's a very good book by Ben Rich, who worked under Kelly Johnson at Skunkworks, that kind of gets into some of the history of that organization.
Great book. Was actually required reading for me at one of the startups that I've worked for, and enjoyed every bit of it. And then the other one you mentioned was The Smartest Guys in the Room.
Yeah, that's an interesting story, I'm trying to think. I haven't figured out the right way to apply that to software engineering yet. I'm still thinking about it. I'm convinced that there is a talk there, but I don't know what it is yet. Instead of talking about that, I'll point your listeners to Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet. It's my favorite management book, and I recommend it to every person I know that's shifting from being an individual contributor to being a manager. And kind of what it gets into, David Marquet is a captain on a nuclear submarine. It's the worst performing sub in the fleet, and he turns it around. He makes it the best performing sub in the fleet, but he does it by being pretty counterintuitive, kind of getting away from the traditional military hierarchy, command and control structure, and instead expecting his staff on the boat to own their areas that they're in charge of, and to declare their intent, to talk about, okay, I'm going to dive us to 1,000 feet, and give him the opportunity to essentially object. And as long as he doesn't object, go ahead and make the move. And building that ownership over time, teaching the folks on the boat, giving them an appropriate level of autonomy within the bounds of safety, eventually did exactly what we were talking about earlier in the call. It built that level of extreme ownership to the point that they all knew their job. They all did their job really well, and it made it the best performing sub in the fleet. And it's sort of one of those things that, like, if you think a high ownership, high autonomy approach to leadership can't work, seeing a case study where it works really well in the U.S. Navy is a pretty good counterpoint to that.
Well, excellent stuff, Nick. As I said before, I'm going to have to go back and rewatch this episode, take some notes. Definitely want to check out some of these books, some of these resources that you recommended, and I want to try out some of the the team building and management suggestions that you recommended as well. Thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today, though. This has been really good. Yeah,
thanks so much for having me on, Adrian. I guess the only thing I would leave your listeners with is I do work at SIM. I got to get a plug in real quick. We build software that lets you declare authorization and approval workflows for production environments using Terraform and Python. So it moves your authorization and approval process alongside the rest of your infrastructure as code. And it seems like something that would be interesting and useful to your audience. So if they're interested, I would encourage them to go check it out at symops.com, symops.com.
And to quote Guillaume from the back channel, this product looks really cool, which is a good sign if nice. Guillaume likes it.
Merci, Guillaume.
Bienvenue.
All right, and stay tuned. When we come back, we're going to talk national cybersecurity strategy with Josh Corman.